Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. Today's guest is Sharon Géno, President of the National Multifamily Housing Council, which represents rental owners, managers, developers, and suppliers who provide rental homes for 40 million Americans. A 30-year veteran of the housing industry, Sharon has led efforts across for-profit and nonprofit sectors to tackle housing affordability, community development, and policy challenges. She previously served as Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Volunteers of America National Services, overseeing one of the nation's largest nonprofit affordable housing operators. Welcome, Sharon. I'm so excited to talk with you today.
Thanks, David. I'm happy to be here, and I'm always pleased at the partnership that we have with NHC. The work that you do here is really critical, bringing all the voices together. So thanks for having me.
Well, that's great. And you've been in the job now for about 2 years, has it been?
A little over 2 years.
And a big change for the organization, I think a big change for you. Tell me about that transition, because you brought a lot of new ideas, new energy, and new experience to NMHC. And in my experience, it shows. So what's that been like?
This has been a great journey for me, David. And sometimes the best things in life are the things you're not necessarily looking for. And this was certainly one of them. As you mentioned, I had worked on the front lines in a nonprofit, affordable, and senior care platform, led them through COVID. It was both a difficult, but also an incredibly rewarding experience, built a team, and really enjoyed that opportunity to run a mission-driven organization. Really happy where I was. And this opportunity came across my desk, and I wasn't so sure that it was something I wanted to pursue. I had worked in the advocacy space earlier in my career and felt like that was something I'd accomplished, and not sure I wanted to jump back into that. But the more time I spent with the officers and the members of the organization, and also my predecessor, Doug Bibby, the more I felt like this was a really great opportunity. And above all things, a incredibly well-run organization. Doug had done amazing work over his 20-plus career at NMHC to build a team and to build really great reputation for the organization. So that was really important to me. But B, it's this moment in time. We have an opportunity unlike none other in my 30-plus year working career in this space to really make change. And while the work I felt I was doing on the front line was very critical, the chance to be part of this moment was almost too juicy to pass up.
Well, you talk about the opportunity to make change, and that it's kind of a loaded proposition, because the reason we need to make change so badly is because we've done such a bad job at building and maintaining affordable housing in the country. And that is true for both renting and home ownership. But in the rental space in particular, it's been very frustrating to be a policy advocate, arguing for more incentives for affordable housing, and finding ourselves in the ongoing challenge of winning the participant ribbon when there are 5 priorities and we're number 4 and only 3 of them get awards. And it's been a little bit of deja vu all over again each time. The one thing that never changes is that the need continues to grow. You're coming into this without, I think, carrying as much of the baggage as many of us do. From your perspective, what do we need to be doing better to take the opportunity we have now in front of us and actually close the deal?
I think your point is a really good one, David. It has always been seen, housing has always been seen from a policy perspective as an optional. It's on the list of things we could do, but maybe we're not going to do. Increasingly, given the housing shortage that we have now come to realize, somewhere between 3.9 and 7.8 million units, and the impact that is having not just on people, but on communities, on our ability to grow economically, on our prominence, frankly, on the world stage. Other countries look at us and say, you're the richest country in the world. Why can't you house your own people? One of the very basic needs and indicators of a civil society you can't produce. We've finally gotten to a point where it can no longer be a nice to have or a choice. There has to be a system where we are investing on an ongoing, regular basis in providing what is a very basic human need, which is shelter. And I think we're now seeing why not doing that has hurt us. So I think that is, in the last election has really brought that to the fore. It was one of the top 3 issues in every national poll I saw. I just spent some time yesterday with some local legislators and mayors, mostly from the conservative side of the aisle. They're like number 1, 2, or 3. It's number 1. We've got this really interesting moment in time. 1, we've got everybody's attention focused on all sides of the aisle. 2, we've got this pressure at the federal, state, and local level. It had always been, well, housing is a federal issue largely from a monetary standpoint. But now what we've come to realize is, where does the rubber meet the road? Really down here at the state and local level. And we haven't paid enough attention to that. And over the last decade, more states and localities have taken the bull by the horns and said, hey, I'm not getting the federal leadership I want. We are going to create housing opportunities and incentives to build because we see what it does at the local level. So 3-dimensional chess now, and that's a unique opportunity. But third, and this is a little bit of a sleeper issue, and I might be wrong about this, but the last election, a lot of people have, said, oh, it's a trifecta, it's a mandate. If you get down into those races, there really is no mandate here. Many of the House races in particular, 51-49, 52-48. So there is, and all of those House members have to run again in 2 years, and a third of the Senate has to run again in 2 years. So there's a real opportunity for members who know they need to capture some portion of folks on the other side of the aisle in order to win their seat back, to come up with bipartisan solutions and not use housing as a political ping pong ball. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, this rank order, we've been politicized way more than we should.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that the mandate is for change in circumstances, not just change in policy. People don't want change for change's sake. They're actually, I think, pretty cynical about that. They're not happy with the way things are. And the reason is because it's just not okay. They experience housing unaffordability themselves. If they're not, their kids are, or their employees, and they recognize that what we're doing isn't working. And the other piece of this is that housing is a major driver of core inflation. And inflation is absolutely a political issue that has to be reckoned with. It's a warning to the new administration, which is housing unaffordability and inflation in general do not discriminate between political parties. You will pay as steep a price as the last guy did if you don't do something about this. And I think that's going to be the challenge, to see what happens, because inflation is brutal to incumbents. And it doesn't matter whether it's your fault or it's not your fault, or it's a little bit your fault, or you did all you could or you didn't. The bottom line is prices are higher and they're not going down. And the fact that they don't go up as fast doesn't help you one little bit. And so we're going to have to get this right. And if those who have been elected want to stay in office, they'll be at the table. And I think we're seeing that.
We need to treat it like it is, which is a crisis. And when you have a crisis, you coordinate efforts, you leverage all of your resources, and you identify it, and you measure your movement towards success. And that's something we've never done in housing because we've pointed the fingers so much, both on either side of the political aisle, but we've also, the local governments have pointed the federal government has pointed the state government has pointed the local government. So it's both and. We've got to depoliticize it a little bit and treat it as the bipartisan issue that it is. And 2, we've got to create a framework so federal, state, and local resources and regulatory structures line up well so we can move the ball forward. And this is not just a government issue alone. This has to be public-private partnership. The government simply is not going to provide money to provide all the housing we need in this nation. It's just not going to happen for a whole variety of reasons. We need private money in this system, and we need to create the incentives, but also the regulatory structure and create a streamlined path for builders, owners, developers, operators, and investors to see that we're taking some of the risk out of this investment dollar that we're putting into this very thing that we need. Investors who have a dollar can go invest in Google stock and have a pretty steady Eddie rate of return and know what that is. They can invest in Amazon stock and have a good sense of what that is. When we want them to entice them to invest in housing, we've got to create an atmosphere where that can be a reasonable rate of return, which is often lower than some of those equities, but people will pick it up because it is a commodity that everybody needs.
This really raises the question of what specifically do we need to do? Because we have a private-public partnership that exists in the low-income housing tax credit, for instance. We have the very real discipline of the pro forma, which says my fixed costs are the same and I'm going to charge more rent and make more money. And the whole point is to make more money if you're a private company, and especially if you're answering to shareholders. And I think that gets a bad rep in Washington sometimes, but good luck trying it any other way. And so how do we help builders become or remain profitable while creating the kind of housing that we need the most, where there's sometimes a gap?
Yeah, again, the challenge is that there is no one magic silver bullet. And we, in Washington in particular, really like that one bill. If we could just pass that one piece of legislation, everything would be great. We need every tool in the toolbox to address this crisis. So, and we have some tools already, but as anyone who's done an affordable deal knows, we've made them very complicated to use. So I think in terms of high-level federal policy, federal money needs to incentivize both the building and filling those gaps in particularly affordable housing that just don't pencil out without those gaps, to incentivize states and localities where the rubber meets the road and where a lot of the risk is in terms of time for permitting, zoning, other things of that nature, and incentivize the states and localities to be true partners in helping the private sector eliminate that risk so they can maximize private investment that's necessary to build housing. I did a blog post fairly recently entitled Housing Costs Money. And oftentimes when we have these policy discussions around housing, we seem to forget that very fundamental part of the equation. If you want and you need the money to build the housing that we need, we have to create the atmosphere where money will come in.
Regulation also costs money. And when we talk about environmental requirements or building requirements or process requirements, and you layer all these things on, you're increasing costs. And the people who are paying for that are going to be folks who either are seeing it in higher rents or in fewer units because subsidy is spent on fewer number of units constructed. And I think that's really been challenging for people in Washington to understand. What are your members telling you about what they're experiencing in this space? Because one of the things that a friend of mine who's a staffer at the Fed says is we pay attention to how we spend our regulatory burden budget. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea of how you budget the regulatory burden has, I think, really gotten out of whack. And it doesn't serve us well for the pendulum to swing all the way back to the other side either, because it just speeds up the pace of the pendulum in both directions.
Absolutely right.
So what do we do about that?
Well, NMHC did some recent research with the National Association of Home Builders. 40.6 cents of every development dollar go to regulatory compliance. Think about how we could stretch those dollars much further if we could just cut that in half or cut that by a third. Think of the units that we could build. So a lot of our members, and again, a lot of the regulation, there's federal regulation, which certainly adds a layer of compliance, particularly if you're using federal dollars, which are the things that are going to help you build the most affordable housing. So there's a built-in disincentive to use those dollars sometimes because you're taking on a federal regulatory scheme, things like compliance with Davis-Bacon wages, compliance with some environmental strategies, compliance with a variety of other things. Not that those things are per se bad, but the way we implement them is problematic, and we could streamline some of that. Then you get down to the state and local regulatory schemes, which can get even more complicated. So I think there's answer in both places, actually, and particularly creating that incentive for affordable. If you're going to do an affordable project, could you get relief from this set of federal regulatory oversight? And while using that federal dollar, instead of layering it on, let's take it off. If you're going to do an affordable project within a certain parameter or create some level of affordability, could we, and some states have already done this, California's done this pretty well, as some other states, create a rocket docket for permitting approval. City of San Diego has done some great work around this as well. So there are solutions. They differ a little bit in every state, and we need to start picking and choosing those things, but packaging them together. Great example of a package, it can't just be one thing. The state of Florida recently passed the Live Local Act. It does 3 things. Those 3 things together work. Any one of those things by themselves may not have worked. So first, they incentivize and require localities to lower barriers and increase zoning to allow for more multifamily building. There's still some back and forth around that, but that's a good start. 2, they put their money where their mouth is. And they put almost $1 billion of new money in 4 different pots to help incentivize housing at different levels. And then finally, they closed the door on rent regulation, which had been preempted by state law there. However, there had been an exception that created additional risk. So lowering that risk so investors know that they can get their costs covered if operating costs go up over time, like insurance and local taxes and other things. 2, putting actual dollars into particularly the affordable side. And 3, enforcing localities to be more flexible in allowing multifamily housing. You got to put those things together, though. Huge bipartisanship around this bill. Not much happens on a bipartisan basis in the state of Florida, but this sure did. Everybody recognized with the growing population there how important it is. And I'm hearing from our members all the time about, hey, I was looking at projects perhaps in some of the other southern states and other places, but I'm going to Florida now because I see the environment with Live Local and the financial opportunities being better. So if other states would copy that, we'd have, I hope, much more spread of investment dollars in communities where they needed it.
So you talk about rent, and you have a policy debate constantly in Washington and local markets certainly as well, and sometimes more around renter protections. Renters often need to be protected, and we certainly don't want to see people put out on the street. And yet the law of unintended consequences is never repealed. And so we end up with efforts to help people. Doesn't always come out that way. Tell me a little bit about how you've been looking at this debate around rent control, renter protections, and eviction moratoriums. What's been the real world impact there?
And it's been very interesting coming out of COVID and seeing the shift that's happened in all of these, in this space in particular. One, we had an eviction moratorium during the COVID crisis. Certainly that was needed for public health reasons for some period of time. It went on too long. And then the concept got elongated and changed and shifted and morphed in various communities across the country. We've seen now over the last couple of years the tremendous painful fallout from that. We have gotten away from the education of both residents and owner, manager, operators of rental housing about what your rights and responsibilities are. There's a pretty good long body of law in every state in the union about what a renter's role and rights and responsibilities are and what an owner operator of rental properties rights and responsibilities are. There is a judicial enforcement mechanism for that. Unfortunately, the moratorium and COVID generally, frankly, interrupted that, and we've lost that. And I think it's really critical that we get back to educating, particularly at the low-income side, that there isn't always going to be an emergency rental assistance program where they can just not pay the rent and pick up some rental assistance and continue. There's another phenomenon that had been percolating before COVID, but it was really exploded since COVID, which is the instance of renter fraud. Technology has advanced to the point where applicants for rental housing can go buy on TikTok. My daughter showed me, because I'm not on TikTok, how you buy a new identity with all the documents necessary to qualify for a rental housing unit that you probably can't otherwise qualify for because you don't have the financial means. Go in there and get the concession, maybe 1 month, 2 month free, and then just not leave and just not pay. And when one person doesn't pay, everyone in that community does not pay. There's also safety concerns about the explosion of fraud. And when our owners take that to the local prosecutor and say, hey, first of all, the court systems have been so backed up post-COVID, it takes a year or 2 years sometimes to move people along, even when you know it's fraud. And then secondly, when they take the claim of fraud and all the documentation to the local prosecutor's like, I've got bigger fish to fry, and they don't take those seriously. There's been a real advancement just very quickly in technology trying to screen for this fraud, but at the same time, the technology is advancing faster too, so the fraudsters are jumping it. So that's an issue we've really got to get our hands around as well.
Not paying rent is contagious because the word gets out in the building, on the floor, among your neighbors, so-and-so isn't paying their rent and they're still here and they just went on vacation. It sounds awful, but it happens. And people start to feel like, why am I paying my rent? What kind of a sucker am I? And it can get out of control very quickly. And I'm not hearing this from for-profit developers. I'm hearing this from nonprofit housing developers who are very progressive and are writing off millions of dollars, particularly in California, but in other areas as well, in losses. And they're beside themselves. Some have actually started selling affordable properties into the for-profit market because they can't afford to keep up the ones that they're keeping. And this is a real crisis. It's a crisis in particular for the nonprofit developers because they're focused on a geography and they're committed to affordable rents. And so they have a lot fewer options. How is that conversation going? I mean, these folks didn't always talk. Your members, your traditional members, and the nonprofit housing developers and building managers who pretty much do the same thing. Are you seeing that change?
Yes. NMHC has always been a big umbrella. So we have always had nonprofit housers and affordable housers within our membership. We haven't always had that, what I think is important, and this is a couple things that we're changing now, that clear collaboration between those groups and being sure that the market rate owners and the affordable owners are collaborating together. It was often the affordable nonprofit owners would be in one corner talking about financing and subsidy, which is what they typically talk about. And the marketplace owners would be talking about rents and investor opportunities. But we share the operating systems and we share those operating regulations, which are so critical. And now that we've seen a breakdown in those systems across both nonprofit and for-profit, there's a lot of coming together. And then one of the things we've worked on very aggressively over the last couple of years is to bring more nonprofit and affordable developers in with more market rate developers. And it's not like one's going to get into somebody else's business necessarily, but increasingly states and localities are requiring some component of affordability if you want to do a larger market rate development. So let's put those folks together and create a marketplace where they can partner, joint venture, and work collaboratively with the people that have the know-how and the experience in doing the affordable piece successfully with those that are going to bring investment dollars and have perhaps the development rights and a little bit more capitalization that they can sustain some of the challenges in a longer development cycle. So we're working on that right now. We have some networking groups around affordable and nonprofits and others, and I'm excited about those opportunities.
So when we look at the policy landscape, we've got a couple of big opportunities. One is the tax bill, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, TCJA, and people who wrote that, I'm not sure they anticipated that President Trump would be back for the reauthorization, but here we are. Now we've got provisions that are expiring. We've got a lot of money on the table. We've got some really important housing bills. One of them is the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. You've got a lot of other priorities also in the tax bill. Tell me a little bit about how you're seeing that, because this is likely to be done in must-pass legislation and under rules that, without taking a swan dive into the weeds of House and Senate procedure, is going to mean we're going to get some legislation passed one way or another. What do you see as your highest priorities, your members, and how are we going to get some of these things over the finish line?
Yeah, the Tax Credit Improvement Act has been at the top of our legislative agenda since inception. Mm-hmm. So even Class A owners within our membership, but also everybody within our membership, understands that if we don't do something to try to solve at least some component of the affordability problem, our ability to maintain other opportunities in the tax bill are going to be limited. So that remains an important part of our legislative agenda. But you have other things that also support real estate investment, different strokes for different folks. But 199A, the carried interest, like-kind exchanges, those kinds of things, while they're a little bit of sleeper issues and sometimes they get put on the table as a trade-off for something else, those are really critical to keeping money flowing through the real estate system. You know, sometimes there's an argument, well, you know, you're just building Class A. That isn't helping the people that really need the help at the affordable space. And while, yes, we critically and desperately, the demand is at that affordable level without a doubt. The research very clearly shows us that any unit of housing is some help. So, you know, the Minnesota Fed recently did some research around filtering and moving units through a system that shows about 7 in every 10 units that are built at a Class A will go all the way down to the lowest income affordability levels over some period of time. So I think we have to look at it more broadly as it's not an affordable unit versus a Class A unit. It's we need all the units, therefore we need all the tax opportunities to get that construction wheel going, because it is going to help us on some level.
And it's not a zero-sum game.
It is not a zero-sum game. We've come from particularly going through the PAYGO years, I was doing appropriations work at that time, we come at this from such a lens of scarcity. We are finally in a place where the purse strings were open during COVID and otherwise. And if that system's going to continue, and I'm not advocating for it necessarily, because I also believe we need to get our hands around the deficit in a big way. But if we're going to spend on something, the payoff in investing dollars, be them through the tax code or be them hard dollars in housing incentives, the payoff is tremendous from an economic growth standpoint, which theoretically will generate more tax revenue. So I'm hopeful that the big picture will prevail as we go through this, but people continue to take these piecemeal, and we really have to start and continue to talk about them as a package.
So we've got the legislative agenda, but we also have a regulatory agenda. We're going to end up with a new secretary of everything. Every major position in the administration is going to get basically turned upside down and inside out. And we have the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't an actual department, but it could actually do more than most. And we'll see. There's, I'm sure, plenty of people in Vegas betting on how long the bromance between Elon Musk and Donald Trump is going to last. But I'm going long on that one. We'll see. I think that it's very interesting when you look at his experience, Elon Musk's, dealing with NASA and the Defense Department and the regulatory morass that exists there. It really defines his perspective on this. And so on the one hand, yeah, he's talking about we have to fire all these people, blah, blah, blah. If you're going to save $2 trillion over however many years, you're probably going to do most of it in defense. That's where the real money is. That's where cost plus contracting is, which he despises and has really done an amazing job of turning that model on its head when you look at SpaceX. But he also has experience dealing with regulations that were written for the Mercury astronauts, that he was told you had to pay thousands and thousands of dollars in compliance cost for something that no longer actually exists. And plus the time value of money. In the housing space, we know that well. Layers and layers of regulations that have been put on top of each other over the years and that have created a dynamic where in the Section 8 program, for instance,
yes,
you've got building owners who are looking at guaranteed rent payment and saying, I can't afford to do that. And that's crazy. But you and I are not the only people who've been saying that. As Doug Bibby used to like to say, I've been saying this for 20 years. I do not want to be here 10 years from now and say, I've been saying this for 20 years. And I know you don't either. So what are we going to do? How do we take advantage of this moment and get people focused on, in many ways, it's about really microsurgery and not slash and burn. But what are your thoughts on that as we begin this new period?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think that's the tricky business. How do we do fundamental shift in a microsurgical way that opens up the vein, if you will, and allows for the system to work much better without cutting the vein, if you will. I really think that's going to be the challenge. The mentality and the rhetoric thus far has been very, very much about the slash and burn, as you phrased it. But I think if somebody is thoughtful and gets in there and there are outcomes that we are clear about it, and this gets back to kind of the earlier part about calling this a crisis. And if HUD is going to be ground zero for the lead agency in dealing with the housing crisis, particularly in the affordable level, they're going to need to come in with, this is a crisis. There is a housing czar at the White House. They're going to hold all agencies accountable. We have determined that the shortage is X, and we are going to get to Y, and we're going to look at every regulation through that lens. Does this get us from the shortage number to more units that we need to meet our goal? And I think if there is a lens or a set of principles and parameters, this is a great moment in time to do this, given the political predisposition. If we go in and just start cutting the arteries, it's going to be a disaster. The other thing I'll mention too—
there aren't that many people at HUD to cut.
Yeah,
I think that's the first thing they're going to find out when they get in there is when they've made everybody come back to work, which I'm a big supporter of because we work in this neighborhood. You know what it's like. Restaurants closed all over the place, empty floors of buildings, a suite next door when you came off the elevator. The economy of D.C. has been devastated.
I live in the city.
This.
It's critical to me personally.
It's just a shame. But if you're the Secretary of HUD and you walk into that building and everybody's back at work, you're going to wonder if they actually are, because you're still going to be walking down empty hallways. Their problem is not having too many people. They don't have enough people. And in many cases, they don't have the right people. So they have to attract new people into the game. You know, if Secretary Turner, once he's confirmed, sat down with you, and I'm sure he will, and says, what do I need to know? And what do I need to do? What do you say to him?
Treat it like a crisis. And, what really promotes there's so many wonderful people in government service. And unfortunately, like anything, there are good and bad multifamily operators. There are good and bad government employees, but there are so many wonderful, dedicated people. How do they come to government service? With a true commitment to making a difference. And I think if you set this up right, the secretary could come in and say, hey, we are going to make a difference here. Here's what we have. We have this challenge. We have this shortage of housing. We're going to get it down to whatever it is in this period of time, set a time frame goal. And I want you to go back and look at your work. And I want you to give me the top 10 things that you can do to help me get from X to Y and quantify how much value and how much ROI, if you will, is in that change and shift. And then let's figure out how to do it and let's get it done. The other kind of sleeper thing about the regulatory environment that I think remains to be seen, that this is the first administration in almost, I guess it'll be 50 years, that's taking over all these federal agencies and all the regulatory oversight without the protection of the Chevron doctrine, which gives tremendous deference to agency decision making. And as I read the opinion in the Loper-Bright case, Justice Roberts said, if you don't like it, go to court. So this will be the first time when there's been a very clear path for agencies that are making change or decisions for people to challenge those and go directly to federal court and have a fighting chance to push back. So I think if if the strategy is a slash and burn, there's going to be a lot of chaos because litigants can come in and challenge those decisions.
It goes both ways.
Exactly. It goes both ways. If there's a really thoughtful approach to this that has what people would see as a positive end game, I think you can avoid a lot of that chaos. But that's a real wild card, and I don't think we have any idea what that's going to look like yet.
No, and the thing about Chevron deference is, in the Loper Bright case, is it doesn't say we're not going to allow you to regulate anymore. It just says you have to stay within the four corners of the legislation. And if you're in those four corners, you're fine. And if you're coloring outside the lines, what we used to say was, well, it's really for the agencies to decide what the lines look like and how far outside of them you can color. And now they're saying, yeah, no, that's not going to be the presumption. But we haven't thrown out any of these rules, and we haven't touched the legislation. Now, in one area, CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, we are going to find it very difficult to modernize CRA because the statute was written in the 70s before we had interstate banking or mobile banking or online banking. And the reality is that none of that is envisioned in a very short statute that, ultimately, if we're going to deal with those issues, we're going to have to rewrite it. But there's other legislation that it really isn't going to be that big a deal. And I think we're going to have to sort through that. And Washington has a habit of having absolutist conclusions about complicated issues that aren't at all absolutist.
I think you're absolutely right. And the statutes were written anticipating great deference to federal agencies. And here's the concept, go write a regulation. It's in the statute. So we're going to be in a different place. But there are other statutes, for example, the Section 8 statute, which is pretty prescriptive in the statute itself. So while you could go in and say, hey, we now have this opportunity to and there's plenty of deregulation to happen in the Section 8 program, don't get me wrong. But there will also it will become clear that some of this is statutory, and in order to truly open that vein and make this a better program, you're going to need to go back statutorily as well.
The cost-benefit analysis is critical. You mentioned that. Elon Musk talks about the idiot index. Have you heard about his idiot index? For those that aren't familiar with it, if the cost of a part is more than 10 times the raw materials, then the person who designed it is an idiot. And I think that's a really good rule to use in terms of federal regulations in the housing world, which is, at what point are we coming up with ways to protect one person while disadvantaging 90? And I think we do that a lot. And we're going to have to come up with our own idiot index. I'm not afraid to use the word idiot when the thing that's being done is idiotic.
Right. And it's like anything else. There are always actors that don't work appropriately in any system. There are always people that are hurt by systems unfairly. Any fair system allows for enforcement against those that don't act appropriately within that system and for case-by-case exceptions for those that legitimately deserving of such review. So I think we can't just go down to that lowest common denominator, that 1 versus the 90 on both sides.
So let's talk a little bit about AI, because it's something that more and more Americans are starting to learn about by using it. There's ChatGPT, there's Perplexity, there's Bing, and all kinds of different ways that we are using AI that we don't even see or know of. In housing, it seems like there are some fascinating ways that we can bring a lot of efficiency using AI, both in terms of building apartments, building homes. Also, we're starting to look at here, rewriting regulations and taking advantage of, the thing about ChatGPT is it's capable of analyzing a huge amount of written information and turning it into data and bringing it together. And when you think about the Section 8 program and you think about all of the studies and the reports and the testimony that's been done, what if you could bring all of that together and coalesce it into a simple set of 20 or 30 recommendations? You and I could never do that. We could never raise enough money to hire enough people to do that. But I'm starting to ask myself, maybe this technology actually already exists on my desktop right now. Why aren't I doing that? So help me understand, how's your industry looking at this, and what are your personal hopes for where we can go?
Now, to your point, we have all been using AI in some fashion or form for decades, or algorithmic data in some fashion or form. I point to the Section 8 program. We've been using algorithmic data to set fair market rents in the Section 8 program since inception. When I was a young consultant and I would go to the HUD office and we had owners that wanted to review the FMRs, they'd hand me 3 books. And each page of the book had a cutout ad from the newspaper that explained what the apartment was and where it was located. And then there were notes. We called the landlord. The landlord told us this. We inspected the unit. The unit told us that. We went and looked at the neighborhood. Here are the neighborhood conditions and notes. Here's what we've concluded. So we've been collecting this data and drawing conclusions from it, particularly in the rent setting area, for a very long time. As you point out, recently there's been a lot of controversy around the use of algorithmic data in rent setting. It's unfortunate because it really diverts from the issue, which isn't the data. It's what are the costs of housing and what's driving the cost of housing, and how do we get our arms around that in different markets? Machines don't set rents. Owners, developers, operators, depending on both the marketplace itself, but also on a whole host of factors. Are they holding it? Are they waiting for more investment? Does it need to be recapitalized? There are a whole host of reasons, not just the data, the rental data itself. So I think AI and the use of data has gotten villainized, not just in rental housing, but it's gotten villainized across various industries, groceries, hotels, et cetera. And there's a lot of fear still. And I hear this analogy all the time about when the automobile was first produced and how people were very concerned that it was going to ruin our society completely. And that is why when we talk about engines in cars, they're called horsepower, because the car makers understood that they had to translate what was already happening into the new system that was going to make it better, stronger, faster. And I think, again, we're going to get over this hump because what's on the other side is so good. And we're already seeing it. NMHC has long had an OpTech conference, which has been kind of for almost 20 years. And we have seen the technology move so far, so fast, not just in helping our owner developer managers manage their properties more cost effectively and provide better customer experience, but also in that customer facing applications, opportunities to guarantee rent for gig workers, opportunities to have positive rent reporting. All those things that are resident facing are made able because technology has advanced a long way. We just formed and launched in October a new sister organization called the Real Estate Technology and Transformation Center. So it will bring together that community of learning among technology providers and owner developer manager operators of housing. So they're talking to each other proactively, not just when they finish the product and they go in and try to sell it to you. We're talking about what's on the horizon and talking together. And then 2, we had our first advocacy day, technology advocacy day. We need to start talking about this from an advocacy perspective to create the environment that we need to continue this innovation. This will be the answer to some of the question, not everything, but to some of the question. But if we stifle that innovation because we're afraid of it, we're never going to get there. I think a lot of that possibility, frankly, is in the construction technology space. Construction costs are not going down. The only way we're going to get there is to use technology to change the way we construct and move that agenda forward as well. And I think that's a place where we're behind as an industry. We're still building like we were building 100 years ago. We've got to find new methodologies, new materials, and work with states and localities to allow for those different kinds of materials to be utilized in the creation, particularly of affordable housing.
The thing that gets me is people are understandably afraid of the technology. They're afraid of the disruption. I get that. But if you think you're going to regulate your way to safety there, you're in a lot of trouble, because the ability of AI to adjust is exponentially more powerful than anything you could do in regulation to keep it from happening. And we really need to think about how we're going to use this technology to our benefit. Whether you're an advocate or a nonprofit housing developer or for-profit, it's how do I make this work, as opposed to how do I prevent this from doing what it was designed to do? Because AI, it learns at a rate that makes Moore's Law look quaint. And, the reality today is that if it wasn't for Amazon.com, you just couldn't get a good buggy whip anywhere. So,
exactly. Isn't that amazing?
which is good news because I don't need one.
Exactly. Because now your car, you can plug your car in because of advancement in technology.
And I do. The last thing I'll say about AI is a story I love to share about BMW and how they adopted an AI program using ChatGPT, because language learning module is a big component of where I think a lot of the change exists. The forms you fill out when you take your car into service, wherever you take it in or whatever kind of car you have, there might be 5 questions. How do we do 1 through 5 on these 5 things? And then there's a box. It says, tell us more about your experience. And you fill in that box and nobody ever reads the box because there's no way anybody could possibly read it. It doesn't occur to me at the time if I put a comment in there, but the reality is that there are tens of thousands of those forms being sent out all over the world in all different languages, and that is never going to get read by anybody because it can't be, except by ChatGPT. And they put this in, and 3 months later, they identified that there was one issue that people kept coming back and saying, it's the 3rd time I brought my car in for service and it's still not right. And they were all different issues, but those issues had one common denominator, a single part that when they retested it was not tested properly the first time and was defective. And before there was a recall, before there was an accident, before it cost them millions of dollars, they were able to quietly go in and replace the parts in those cars to fix how the part was made and saved more money than they had spent on the entire AI project. And that's how we have to think about this.
Exactly.
And I think we can. We're perfectly capable of thinking outside the box because the box has not been serving us terribly well.
The thing that's so interesting about this moment in time is you have still within the workforce people at huge different varieties of levels of comfort with that technology space. You have people, and not to be ageist, but you have some people on the higher end of the age scale who don't want to touch it, don't want to look at it and have some fear of it. You have people kind of in my age bracket who, we start our careers perhaps with computers on, like when I started practicing law in 1991, we were the first class of new associates at the law firm to get computers on our desks. That was revolutionary. And the senior partners were very concerned that all we were going to be doing was typing and that it was going to make us less efficient, not more efficient. And this was going to be a problem. Obviously, fast forward now, and no one would think twice about that. You have people in their 30s who were in high school or grade school and learned this through their education system. I was not one of those people. I learned on the fly. And then you have people like my kids who have had some form of technology in front of their face since they were in 7th or 8th grade, at least. So it's you have very different levels of comfort in using those systems. As time goes on over the next decade or so, that comfort level is going to accelerate. And I think the technology is going to grow even more exponentially because that comfort level, those people with that even greater comfort level are coming into the workforce and making a difference.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, if you're not afraid of the future, it can be very exciting and interesting. And the good news and the bad news is we don't actually get a choice on that.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. It's always fun to talk to you in every forum, this one in particular. We're going to have a very interesting and invigorating year ahead of us, and we'll come back and talk about what we got done.
Well, thank you, David. And I hope we can come back here in a year and say this was the year for housing.
Amen to that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.